Chapter 37. The Fountains of Youth. Fountain of Youth. My youth then restored me. Life let me enjoy. My youth with its pleasures that never can cloy. Faust, Goethe. Altafora proposed to make the trip to the islands on the Great Eagles. The idea of taking a journey of 600 miles on feathered steeds was novel, and I accepted. Having taken occasional incursions on them with the prince, I had become quite adept in eagle riding. One morning we attired for the trip, fastened a pair of aerostats and gyros to our shoulders in case of accident. Ronzal saddled the eagles, Altafora mounted Ombrium, and I Lucia. They spread their mighty pinions. We rose from the ground and flew over the city and surrounding country at moderate speed in order to view the charming scenery. During the journey, Altafora, in the exuberance of his spirits, indulged in various gymnastic pranks, standing upright in his saddle, turning somersaults, hanging by an arm or a leg around Ombrium's neck. His audacious daring made me shudder. We were elevated 1,000 feet in the air. All at once, to my horror, he sprang from the saddle, falling 200 feet. I fully expected to see him dashed to pieces on the ground. When the crystal globe of his aerostat began to emit showers of electric sparks, his fall was gradually checked, and he hung motionless in the air. Ombrium swooped down like a meteor and hovered beneath with expanded wings. Altafora remounted and flew to my side. "Altafora," I said, "don't indulge in these feats. They are too terrible to witness." "There is no danger, I assure you." "Suppose your aerostat had got out of order. You would have been dashed to pieces." "Not so. Ombrium would have dove down and caught me ere I reached the ground. He can dive swifter than a body can fall. Now I'll show you. I'll jump off without my aerostat and get 100 feet start, call to my bird, and you'll see how quickly he'll catch me. I've done it often." "No! For heaven's sake, no!" I exclaimed. By noon we had made 400 miles and reached the base of the mountain range, ascended the rising slope, passing over deep gorges, ravines, cliffs, and finally reached the summit. The view was magnificent, great mountain peaks from 15 to 20,000 feet high, capped with snow. In the valleys and along the mountain slopes were great forest trees, some varieties common to our world, mingled with species unknown there. Many were of an immense size, from 300 to 400 feet high, with trunks 15 to 30 feet in diameter and crowned with vast canopies of foliage. We now dismounted and tethered the eagles, sat down on the grass and took refreshments, giving them an occasional morsel. Birds began to assemble around, eagles, vultures, osprey, hawks, and other predatory birds, manifesting the great awe in the presence of our feathered steeds. Ombrium and Lucia regarded them benignly as a pair of gamecocks would a brood of chickens. After a short rest we remounted, flew down the mountain slope, and directed our course due south, swiftly passing over the country, reaching the southern seashore of the continent, and alighting on a sandy beach. Before us stretched the great Voldraga Ocean, which is about 2,500 miles long by 500 to 800 miles wide. It is subject to violent storms, cyclones, and tidal waves, such as are sometimes seen in our Caribbean Sea and Indian Ocean. On the opposite side, across the equator, lies the great continent of Sonora, Luzon. The day was bright and unusually warm, and although there was little or no breeze, the tide swept along the shores with great power and speed, and the waves rolled high. This is caused by the powerful tidal action of Mars's two moons, whose orbits lie nearly in the plane of the planet's equator. We took a short rest, then put out over the ocean. After a flight of 200 miles, a group of small islands appeared in the distant horizon. They were evidently of volcanic origin, resembling the peaks of submerged mountain chain like the Azores or the Polynesian clusters of our Pacific. We approached one of the larger, which was several miles long, and environed by a great coral reef against which the waves dashed tumultuously. Its shores consisted of lofty precipices of red and yellow rock alternating with sandy beaches. We flew over these and entered the interior country, which was covered with dense forests and swamps, teeming with a rank and luxuriant vegetation. Several miles distant was a great volcano in full action, spouting columns of flame and smoke. Its thunderings and explosions resounded over the sea. Amid the rocks were boiling springs and geysers, throwing up great columns of water mingled with clouds of steam and sulphurous vapors. The atmosphere had a peculiar hazy and yellowish appearance, as if permeated with volcanic dust. The heat was like that of the tropics. Birds of strange and uncouth form flitted among the trees, uttering discordant cries. Insects of all kinds buzzed through the air, while the dank morasses and jungles resounded with the snorting and bellowings of huge monsters and reptiles, such as are unknown on our earth. "This is Dusha Ilios, or Magic Isle," said Altafora. "Its whole physical appearance, its flora and fauna, seems to present a perfect picture of the reptilian age of Earth's latter geological epochs, long before the creation of terrestrial man," said I. "It is one of our zoological and botanical gardens," replied Altafora. "Its physical features are quite adapted to the maintenance of these forms of vegetable and animal life. The seeds of the planet and young of nearly all the monsters and reptiles of these forests and swamps were brought by Asterian's ancestors from the planet Venus many years ago. They have greatly increased in numbers. We allow the latter to propagate and utilize them for studies in prehistoric natural history. When we take our journey to Venus, which I look forward to as soon as Asterian returns from his trip to the asteroids, we shall have a splendid field for study in this direction, and plenty of fine sport." We now entered an open glade surrounded with trees. In the center stood a lofty hillock of red rock surmounted by a circular platform on which stood a great urn-shaped basin of dark blue marble. It was filled to the brim with a bright aureate-colored water, which, bubbling over, steamed down the sides of the basin and ran in a little rivulet towards the woods. Near by was a commodious house of red stone. "This is the famous Fountain of Youth," said Altafora. We dismounted from the eagles and permitted them to roam around in search of food, of which the forests and jungles abounded in plenty, then walked to the house, where we were greeted by Pedro, the keeper of the fountain, a sturdy and honest old Nilatin, with his 2 sons who had charge of the medicinal flower gardens. Pedro took his key, ascended the hillock, and opened the valves of the basin. An immense column of water, resembling liquid gold, spouted up, falling back like showers of glittering gems. It was boiling hot. We filled our cups, and after cooling, drank of it. The effect was almost magical. In a few moments we were entirely relieved from the fatigue of the journey, and experienced a feeling of greatly increased strength and vigor. At the foot of the hillock was an iron door. Pedro opened it. We took lighted torches and descended a long spiral staircase of stone, reached a great vaulted cavern. It was pervaded with a peculiar electric aura, which produced a tingling sensation in our faces and hands and made our hair almost stand on end. In the center of the cavern was a deep and dark abyss, from which ascended clouds of steam, and the sound of boiling waters was heard from below. "The waters of the fountain," said Pedro, "issue from deep volcanic reservoirs, where they are subjected to intense heat and the action of electrical and chemical forces of rare metals and minerals." Leaving the cavern, we visited the gardens of the medicinal plants. Pedro, who was learned in this department of botany, gave us interesting descriptions of their wonderful healing properties. The day declining, we took quarters in his house for the night, and next morning, remounting the eagles, continued our journey over the island. In a few hours we reached a small and picturesque lake, surrounded by precipices, forests, and mossy glades. We dismounted, tethered the eagles, and taking seats under the trees, Altafora took out his tablets and began to make a sketch of the scene. Suddenly, Ombrium muttered a loud scream of rage and struggled to break loose from his bonds. The scream was answered by a loud and discordant cry from above. "Look, look!" said Altafora, pointing upwards. A giant winged reptile was flying overhead. It was 20 feet long and covered with black scales. Its neck was like a serpent's, its head and jaws like an alligator's, and armed with sharp teeth. Its wings were shaped like those of a bat, with long hooks. Its hind legs were like those of the stork, with long curved talons. Its forked tail waved to and fro like a whip-lash. As the hideous creature flapped its wings, its eyes blazing like coals of fire, it resembled one of the flying dragons of ancient fable. "What is that horrible monster?" I asked. "It is a Ganathrip thragos, or alligator bat," replied Altiphora. "It resembles the pictorial illustrations of our pterodactyls," said I, "a species of flying reptile that flourished during the early geological ages of our planet, and whose fossil remains, in company with those of other reptiles, are found in various parts of Earth." A number of these reptiles were brought from Venus many years ago when they were young by Asturion's ancestor and placed in the zoological gardens on some of the islands. We allow them to propagate in limited numbers to illustrate our studies in ancient natural history. The gardens are surrounded by high and strong walls to keep them from straying out, for many of those monsters are dangerous. This fellow has evidently broken loose from his enclosure and is on a voyage of discovery. The flying monster was followed by several others, uttering harsh grunts and roars. Ombrium and Lusa seemed transported with rage as they glanced upwards, snapping their beaks and struggling in their bonds. "Here come 3 big fellows," said Altiphora. The giant reptiles now loomed over us. They were much larger than the others. Their wings stretched a full 40 feet. Their jaws could take in the body of a man. The loud flapping of their wings sounded like the sails of windmills. "Our birds are impatient for battle," said Altiphora. "I will let them loose." "They're no match for those huge reptiles," I replied. "One snap of their jaws would crush them instantly." "You shall see how the eagles will serve them out," said he, beginning to unloosen the tethers. In the meantime, the reptiles had flown over a lofty rock and disappeared from view. In a few moments, loud cries of alarm were heard. We rushed down to the beach, ran around the rock, and saw a small boat, manned by a single oarsman, pulling swiftly towards the shore. In the stern was crouched a young woman, screaming with terror. Over her stood a tall and powerfully built man, desperately defending himself and companions from the flying monsters, who were swiftly pursuing the boat, wheeling to and fro over the occupants, trying to seize them with their jaws or talons, while the man was vainly striving to beat them off with his oar. "Good God!" exclaimed Altiphora. "They will be devoured by the monsters." We quickly unloosed the eagles, and snatching up broken branches of a tree, ran to the beach. The boat reached the shore, and the occupants sprang out as we rushed forward to aid them. With loud screams of rage, Ombrium and Lusa dashed towards the reptiles, who flew forward to meet them, twisting their long snaky necks in all directions, snapping their jaws and uttering horrible roars. The eagle circled high above them for a moment. Then Ombrium suddenly swooped down on the largest and grasped its neck with his powerful talons. The monster fought desperately with its hooked wings and claws in vain. Ombrium's talons clutched deep into its windpipe. The reptile opened its bloody mouth, thrust out its tongue. Its eyes seemed bursting from their sockets, until finally strangled, Ombrium let go and the hideous body fell with a crash onto the ground. In the meantime, Lucia had not been so fortunate in her attack on the other monster, which had managed to seize her foot in its jaw. Lucia plied repeated blows with her beak on the skull of her antagonist in vain. Finally, with 2 well-directed strokes, she pecked out both eyes, but the blinded monster still held on. Ombrium flew to her assistance, clutched the reptile's neck in his talons, and speedily strangled him. In the meantime, Altiphora and I killed the 3rd monster with our clubs, and aided by the stranger and his oarsman, we succeeded in beating off the 3 more reptiles who had joined in the assault, but they fled over the lake with loud screams. The stranger was a tall, fine-looking, elderly gentleman with a jolly, good-natured countenance, and richly dressed. The lady was bewitchingly handsome, with winsome eyes and fascinating manners. "Your Royal Highness," said the stranger with a courtly salutation, "I am Lord Chomovant of Huntozan, cousin to His Highness Prince Dijuvar of Sondora Luzion, but not overproud of the relationship, I beg to assure you. Permit me to introduce my newly wedded wife, Lady Chomovant, formerly Ilfine Joymal, the distinguished comedian of our Theatre Royal. You have saved our lives, Prince Mandal Ultima, and we owe you and your friend a corresponding debt of gratitude." "Speak not of it, I beg you," courteously replied the prince. "I'm only too happy to have rendered your lordship this service. The more so it gives me the very pleasure of meeting in the person of Lady Chomovant. so distinguished an ornament of the Martian comic drama, and Altafora gallantly kissed her ladyship's fair hand. Lady Chumavant replied to the prince's compliment in terms winning and graceful, showing that she was thoroughly au fait in court etiquette. Altafora then introduced me. I'm truly delighted to meet you, Lord Lieutenant, replied her ladyship. Your great courage and gallantry in saving the lives of His Royal Highness and the Prince Solima, who is the most lovely and charming of womankind, are the theme of all praise. Oft have I gazed at eventide on your world, our beauteous evening star. Oft have I longed to behold one of the inhabitants of that world. Particularly of the masculine gender, my dear, interrupted his lordship with a twinkle in his eye. Certainly, she replied with a merry laugh and bewitching glance at me. Really, Lieutenant, if your terrestrial gentlemen are all so brave and handsome, I fear we susceptible Martian ladies would quickly lose our hearts should we meet them. Ahem, retorted his lordship. I am quite sure the terrestrial ladies are paragons of grace and beauty, and I shall solicit His Highness to take me with him on his next trip to that planet. And you may be quite sure, my dear, I'll take my heart along with me also. Whereat the young bride administered a not so very gentle reproof on her gallant spouse's ear. Lord Chumavant informed us that he was on his bridal trip, taking a short tour over the islands with a party of friends in airships. He and his wife were rowing over the lake in their little boat when the alligator bats, escaping from their enclosures, attacked them. In a short time, a handsome air chariot manned with its crew came flying over the lake and descended to the shore. With many courteous expressions of gratitude, my lord and lady made their adieus, embarking on their chariot, and flew swiftly on their homeward way. His lordship is a good-natured, jolly, easy-going sort of fellow, rather wild in his bachelor days, but truthful and honourable, although altogether different from his rascally cousin, Prince Diovijar, remarked Altafora. His young bride, Elfine, is one of the most renowned comedians of their kingdom, highly esteemed, and deservedly so. Her character is above reproach, and she will make him a good wife. We remounted the eagles, continued on our trip over the island, spent the night in Pedro's house, and early next morning wended our flight homeward to the palace of the Grand Duke. Little did I dream that this chance meeting with the Lord and Lady Chumavant would be the means of gaining me friends in this hour of fearful peril, and of rescuing one who is dearer to me than life itself from a fate worse than death. On the following morning, Duke Altheon, Onagar, and King Polath were assembled in the council chamber of the palace, and Lord Montobar announced that he had delivered the Duke's message to King Probitus, but that the Prince Djuvar was not to be found. Humph, muttered Onagar. His Highness is evidently hiding somewhere. One of the gentlemen of the chamber was now announced the arrival of Colonel Armatov, a special messenger from the court of Sondor Luzion. Admit his grace, said Duke Althethon. Colonial Armatov, with several officers of his suite, entered the room. He was a man of middle age, bright bronze complexion, showing his pure Arunga lineage unmixed with Pluto-Martian blood, and one of the highest peers of his realm. He was an officer in the Royal Life Guards of the king. His air and bearing were dignified and soldierly. Altheon and Onagar greeted him with great cordiality. He was also an old friend of King Poleth. I have the honor to be the bearer of this communication from His Royal Majesty and the Minister of State to your Highness, presenting a letter sealed with the coat of arms of Sondor Luzion to Duke Altheon, who opened it and read it. To His Grace Altheon, Grand Duke Regnant of Mandal Utama and the Royal Highness, the Prince Altafora, and Prince Sulima of the Royal House Thulavar, greeting. The Minister of State has the honor to convey the salutations of His Royal Majesty Probitus of Kingdom of Sondor Luzion to His Grace, the Grand Duke Regnant of their Highness, the Prince and Prince Mandal Ultima, together with his sincere regrets that His Royal Highness Prince Djuvar should have so far forgotten the honors and courtesies due to His Grace, the Grand Duke Altheon and their Royal Highnesses, on the night of the festival, etc., etc., and begs the acceptance on the part of the Grand Duke and the Royal Highness the sincere apologies of His Royal Majesty in behalf of His Royal Highness Prince Djuvar. with sentiments of the most distinguished consideration to his Grace, the Grand Duke Regnant, and their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess Mandel Ultima, the Minister of State, has the honor to be, etc., etc. Elif Iruak Jandofothos. Elif Iruotha Jovandus. At this moment, Prince Hanovian entered. The Duke handed him the letter, then to Colonel Armatov. This apology is perfectly satisfactory, Your Grace. Then to the Lord Montabar. Please convey to His Majesty King Probitus and to His Excellency, the Minister of State, the sincere thanks and high considerations of Duke Altheon of Mandal Ultima. Lord Montabar sat down to write. Prince Harnavian stepped forward, and with a courtly salutation to Colonel Armatov, "My Lord Duke," said he, "you are aware that my rank and the intimate relations of friendship existing between my own and the kingdom of Mandal Ultima entitle me to say that, while this apology on the part of His Majesty is highly honorable, it does not satisfy me. I have already demanded an apology from the original offender, and cannot accept one from His Majesty in lieu thereof." "I regret being compelled to announce to your Highness," replied the Duke, "that diligent search has been instituted to find the Prince Divijar, but his whereabouts are unknown." "Pooh!" exclaimed the Prince scornfully. "Your Grace will not have far to search. Send out a posse of your court pages. I'll warrant they'll find him skulking behind the petticoats of his court beauties." The Duke shrugged his shoulders. The coward and the sneak. I'll not stoop to cross swords with him. 'Twould disgrace my steed. If I ever come across him outside his kingdom, I'll lash him with my horse's trainer whip till he begs for mercy. The Duke, brave soldier as he was, fell back before the fiery impetuosity of the Prince. "Divijar's act is universally denounced by the whole rank and file of our army and the Royal Life Guards, of which I am sorry to say he holds by courtesy the rank of colonel," replied he. "The only excuse we can make for his conduct is that he must have been intoxicated at the time." "Which he generally is, except when he engages in something worse," remarked Duke Onajar. "Were any prince or officer of my kingdom to perpetuate such an act, whether drunk or sober, he would be cashiered and disgraced from the ranks instanter," said King Polath. "I have the honor to convey a communication from the Minister of State to Lieutenant Hamilton," continued Colonel Armatov, presenting me with a letter, which I opened and read. "The compliments of the Minister of State of Sandor Luzamon to Lieutenant Hamilton of the United States of America, situated on the planet Earth, and requests the pleasure of his company at dinner on the day at 7 o'clock p.m. I glanced at the Duke inquiringly. "Accept by all means," he said. "You will find His Excellency an accomplished gentleman and charming host." "To which it gives me great pleasure to certify, and I hope that you will have the pleasure of meeting Lieutenant Hamilton on that occasion," said the Colonel. The Lieutenant's acceptance was drawn up and dispatched together with a letter of Duke Altheon to the Minister of State by Lord Montabar, who had received a similar invitation. As the dinner was set for the next day, Colonel Armatov and the suite accepted the Duke's invitation to remain overnight, and we would start on the following morning in the airship for that kingdom. Towards the close of the day, Dr. Hammerville took me aside. "I will now give you information concerning the Minister of State, whose invitation you have received, and I can assure you it is a distinguished honor. Elif Uruxi Jovandes is a most remarkable man of the age, a giant intellect and wonderful gifts, the greatest of all Martian statesmen, and the power behind the throne. On his accession to the premiership, the kingdom of Sandor Luzion was in a state of anarchy and almost dissolution. But by his consummate ability, tact, and force of will, he has unearthed every dark plot and secret conspiracy, and consolidated or crushed every enemy arrayed against him. He has done more to establish the prosperity, wealth, and power of his kingdom than any monarch or minister of state that ever preceded him. He wields his power with an iron hand, and his influence is felt and acknowledged in every kingdom of our world. He is descended from one of the most renowned Plutonian kings, and is eminently worthy of his noble lineage. Personally, he is of commanding stature and dignified presence, yet his manners are exceedingly winning. He possesses a personal magnetism few can resist, and reads the character of everyone who enters his presence almost at a glance. He cares nothing for honors, wealth, nor the objects that usually engage the ambitious desires of men. For a prince and a statesman occupying so high a position, said I, this is certainly extraordinary. I doubt whether in the courts of kingdoms of earth such an instance of indifference to worldly renown could be found. He accepts his title merely as the insignia of his official position. Of pure life and upright character, he despises the allurements of beauty, the ostentation displays, frivolous amusements, and pleasures of royal courts. This certainly seems more remarkable, and could not be affirmed of any royal or aristocratic individual on my planet. He wields a most extraordinary influence over the minds and actions of his fellow men. The strongest intellects yield to his indomitable will. He also possesses astonishing powers over the many of the elements and forces of nature, which in their manifestations are almost miraculous. Some of our over-scrupulous theologians who know little or nothing of natural or occult science darkly hint that he is in league with satanic powers. But from whatever source he derives them, he wields them for good. The court, royal, and fashionable circles of Sondor-Luzon, with a few exceptions, are given up to the gratification of pleasure, luxury, and ostentation. This corruption has infected a great part of the Plutonian Martian population. Alif is the only safeguard of the realm. He stands between the oppressions of the nobles and the rights of the people who love him. The great mass of the royal aristocracy hate him, yet stand in dread of his power. The unfortunate Emperor Probitus, a good but feeble monarch, and who is now in his last illness, clings to his minister, for he knows full well that Alif alone can save his kingdom from ruin. I greatly desire to meet this remarkable man, I replied. On the following morning, I donned my naval uniform, and accompanied by Lord Montalban and Duke Armatov, we embarked on his airship for our journey to the great city of Jrny, the capital of Sondor-Luzon, which is about 1,500 miles distant. We swiftly flew over the city and continent of Mandal Ultima, and crossed the Vodraga Ocean, and entered the kingdom of Sondora. The country is under the highest cultivation, abounding in beautiful landscapes, lakes, mountains, ranges, and linear cities. Towards afternoon we reached an immense plain traversed by a broad and beautiful river, resembling our Hudson, but larger and more picturesque. On its southern shore stood the capital city of Jrny, which in its grandeur of dimensions and splendor of adornment, in many respects surpasses the beauty of Elfrizel. It is the largest of the Martian capitals, covers an area of 6,000 square miles, and contains a population of 20 millions, comprising of the royal family and the elite of the Pluto-Martian nobility and aristocracy. Passing rapidly over its splendid avenues, palaces, and magnificent buildings, whose domes and towers glitter under the rays of the setting sun, we reached the palace of the Minister of State in the eastern quarter of the city, a grand and massive structure of dark gray marble. Its grounds were embellished with magnificent trees, flowering plants, and ornaments with fountains and statuary. The airship descended to its platform on the glade. We were escorted by officers of the household through a lofty portico to an antechamber, thence into the reception room, and were received by the Minister of State.